Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to speak about Emily Dickinson, an eminent American poet. We are going to talk about her life, story, and her poems in particular. Emily Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830, in a Puritan family of Amherst, Massachusetts. Her father was a famous lawyer, politician, and treasurer of Amherst College. She received her college education there, and for some time she went to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Now, people say that it was the only time which she spent outside her home. After spending some time, she returned home, but due to ill health, she did not go back to Mount Holyoke. She lived a simple life and kept single all her life. She enjoyed gardening and writing, and she tried to avoid visitors. She walked the hills with her dog, and in the beginning, though she was a fun-loving child, but as she grew, she liked to keep herself in her own room. Here we find that her lifestyle was similar to that of Jane Austen. She started writing poems, but she did not think of getting those poems published, and nobody knew in her family that she was writing poems or she had the poetic talent. But by 1858, she realized that she was gifted with poetic talent, and then she started keeping the poems written by herself in a box. But still, she did not let the people know that she was writing poems. She wrote about approximately 1,775 poems, but only 7 of them were published in her lifetime. She just sent her poems to Samuel Bowles, and he tried to get 2 poems published, but he just made some changes. Later on, she just sent her poems to Thomas Dickinson, who she considered as her mentor, and they just corresponded with each other, and they did not meet very often, but it was Dickinson who just suggested what she had to do, and he did not try to discourage her from poetry writing. Now, in many of her poems, we find the mention of someone who she loved. But we are not sure who the person was. I mean, she had some kind of feelings for Benjamin Newton. She also had some feelings for Reverend Charles, who she met at Philadelphia. She tried to speak about her failure in her love life. But we are not sure who the person she wanted to speak about. She just did not want her poems to be published because before her death, she just asked her sister to burn all her poems. However, her sister published all those beautiful poems after her death. Now we will just try to analyze her poems. We find in her poems that they do not adhere to the rules of versification, or she wrote in a different manner. Most of her poems do not have any title. This is a peculiarity of her poems, and therefore they are known either by the first line or the number given to them. Anyhow, when we read her poems, we find a strong influence of Puritanism on her thought, pessimism, and the tragic tone of her poems prove this. And she just tried to write about death and immortality, and we find that most of her poems are about death, soul, immortality, God. Now we find that her treatment of death is, of course, different from that of other poets. She kept herself in her room. She did not like to mix up with people, and therefore she tried to think about the psychology of human beings, and she did try to explore the inner world of the human beings she came into contact with. Another peculiarity or special quality or the trait we find in her poems is severe economy of expression. The images she did use in her poems are original images. The language is direct and plain. There is a great influence on the Imagist movement in the 20th century. She was a poet par excellence as far this is concerned. Now let us look at the features of her poems. When we talk about the subject matter of her poems, we find that it is like the great romantic poets of her time. Her poems are short, many of them being based on a single image or symbol, but within her little lyrics, she wrote about some of the most important things in life: love, nature, morality, immortality. She wrote about success, which she thought she never achieved. And she wrote about failure, which she considered her constant companion. Now we come to feel that she was a pessimist rather than being an optimist. And we also come to know that those people for whom she had some feelings, they did not remain close to her. They either moved away to a distant place, or she was afraid of being close to them. She wrote about failure. She wrote of all these things in such a brilliant way that she is now ranked as one of America's greatest poets. Poetry is for Dickinson a means to attain pleasure, a way to preach her doctrine, and a medium to express her outlook of the world, an outlet for her despair and frustration, and a remedy to pacify her soul. Her life experience fostered her belief as an existentialist as well as a great poet. Whatever she felt or experienced in life, she tried to unfold it through her poems. Despite her solitary life, or you can say seclusion of life, Emily Dickinson covered a wide range of subjects in her poetry. Her favorite subjects were love, death, natural beauty. She had a keen sense of observation. She had a kind of attraction towards the objects of nature. In her writing, she wrote about life and death, expecting to understand the meaning of life or the enigma of life by understanding the meaning of death. She considered death to be unavoidable. Therefore, the best method was to treat death as a friend. Living in the 19th century, a comparatively religious era, she did not belong to any organized religion. She believed in God. She wrote about God, man, and nature. She probed into the spiritual unrest of man and often doubted about the existence and benevolence of God. She addressed God by using the word king, the emperor, and she just considered nature to be her church, and she was able to converse with God directly when she was in company of nature. Emily Dickinson was a poet who could express feelings of deepest poignancy in terms of the true and white saying, often in an aphoristic style. Her gem-like poems are all very short, but fresh and original, marked by the vigor of her images, the daring of her thought, and the beauty of her expression. She wrote in the conventional metrical form, though she did not always strictly observe the rules of versification. She defamiliarized conventional poetic form, deliberately overusing capitalization and dashes to make her poems look strange. In some way, she is very much similar to the style of John Donne. Her style and her themes did make people call her a metaphysical poet. Sometimes we fail to understand her philosophy, but when we read her poems, we find that these poems do not end with a full stop. It means life is an enigma. It is a puzzle which it is very difficult to solve. Now, some of her poems, which are very popular, or you can say very, which are read very often, we will try to look at some of them. But let us see the titles of the poems. Because I could not stop for death. I heard a fly buzz when I died. Now, because I could not stop for death, now this shows that death had to come in person to receive her, to take her away from this mortal world into some other world. I heard a fly buzz when I died. You know, the poet is imagining her own death. My life closed twice before its close. This poem does throw light on her sorrowful experiences when she was very melancholic. As imperceptible as grief, mine by the right of the white election, wild nights, a narrow fallow in the grass, apparently with no surprise. I died for beauty, but was scared. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. It is only a poem of 4 or 5 lines, but these lines contain a philosophy. I like to see it lap the miles. The brain is wider than the sky. Now let us take this poem. Because I could not stop for death. In the first stanza, the angel of death, in the image of a kind person, comes in a carriage for the sake of immortality and the poet. Stanza second, that is stanza 2. To show her politeness to God of death, she gave up, or I will use the pronoun I. To show my politeness to God of death, I gave up my work and my enjoyment of life as well. I gave up my life. In the third stanza, the poet says, the journey of a carriage implied the experience of human life. School implies time of childhood. the fields of gazing grain for youth and adulthood, while the setting sun, the old age. In the fourth stanza, probably, we may say, the sun sets before we reach the destination, the night falls, death arrives. I felt a fear, and I felt a kind of fear and felt chilly after death, for my shroud is thin and my scarf too light. Despite the description of death, the usual gloomy and horrifying atmosphere is lightened by the poet with the elegantly fluttering clothing she describes. In the fifth stanza, several centuries had passed since the arrival of death upon her. However, she felt it is shorter than a day. On that day, I suddenly realized that death is the starting point for eternity, and the carriage is heading towards it. The poem is discussing death, a very gloomy subject, but it is done with a rather light tone. The tone is light just because the author does not take death as a catastrophe. Instead, she treats the angel of death as a very polite gentleman, as a long missing guest, giving up her work and leisure, putting on her fine silky dresses. She accompanies death in the same carriage to eternity. All the beauty of this work lies in the process, in the poetess's open-minded attitude towards death. Another poem which is worth reading is I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. The very first line is somewhat queer or strange. We don't understand how can a person see or hear or use her senses after her death. But here we should notice that the poet is imagining her own death. In the first stanza, she says, when I was dying, I heard the buzz of a fly, which reminded me of the stillness in the air. The stillness in the air, it just reflects or describes the stillness of the atmosphere or the environment when a person is on his or her deathbed. In the second stanza, before the absolute power of death, I was helpless, so were my relatives and friends. They could do nothing more than gathering around me, tearless and breathless, and watching the arrival of death to me. When I was, in the third stanza she says, when I was abandoning this material world, a fly comes to me. Now, this poem is the description of the moment of death. The poet made use of a very strange image of a fly to symbolize her last touch with the human world, and moreover, the perspective of a decaying corpse. The fly appeared as something which is able to fly between the two worlds of life and death. Because the word fly is very cleverly used in the work, on the one hand, it refers to that insect. On the other hand, it may indicate free flying. Before death, the fly was buzzing around. I hear it. After death, it may lead me to go far, and forever I am flying. The fly is inconsequently of little importance, implying perhaps that death is the same. Other poems also have this kind of subject matter or theme, you can say, and her handling of the theme. In that poem, the soul selects her own society. The poetess says that she is very fortunate for her soul that is willing to select her own company. And she doesn't allow her soul to wait for the guests, whoever may be waiting outside, because she takes the soul and shuts the door. Now, the soul is unmoved by the presence of divineness. The soul is not won by worldly rank or power. A number of words indicate status: chariot, low-gate, emperor, kneeling mat. Who is the superior worldly status? Is there a suggestion of status and superiority in some other scale of values? Dickinson depicts the rigor and the finality of the soul's choice. The soul selects her own society, then dash shuts the door, dash to her divine majority, present no more, unmoved, dash. She notes the chariots, dash, passing, dash, at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor be kneeling upon her mat. I have known her from an ample nation choose one. Then close the valves of her attention like stone. Now, there are poems which do tell us about her desires, or you can say her imagination, when she considers herself to be a queen. But Emily Dickinson makes it clear that even if she becomes a queen one day, she would not behave like an ordinary queen. Her style would be different. So we come to know that whatever she did, she made it simple or clear through her poems that she wanted to be original. She wanted to live her life the way she liked. Now, when we try to look at the work of Emily Dickinson, we find that she was not a human being who did not have common interests. She did write about love, nature, but most of her poems, they are about solitariness, seclusion, death, now despair, then God, immortality, and we find that she did not try to paint a beautiful picture or the bright picture of life. She concentrated her attention on the sad, gloomy aspect of life, and most of all, she considered death to be inevitable, and she tried to be prepared for death whenever it came to take her away from this physical world into some other world. Now, Emily Dickinson is indeed a poet who has a style of her own, and it is, though it is a fact that her poems were not published during her lifetime, but after her death, her sister Lavinia, when she got the poems published, everyone knew that in Emily Dickinson was a great American poet. And of course, her work did earn a great reputation. Thank you.